After Rome fell, the kingdoms that rose from the ashes. Picture this. You wake to silence. No legion drums, no imperial orders, just mist curling over broken roads. Britain, once a province of Rome, is suddenly on its own. That's where our story begins. Before we dive in, help us turn this into a real series by pushing us to 1,000 likes. Now breathe in the cold air of a world after empire and ask the question everyone feared. When Rome leaves, who gets to rule now? When the Romans finally left Britain in the early 5th century, life began to unravel. The roads were still there, the villas still stood, but the order Rome had built was gone. Tax collectors stopped coming, markets shrank, towns struggled to hold on. It felt like the warmth of an empire had gone cold overnight. We only get faint echoes from this time, scraps of sermons, angry words from monks. One monk named Gildas described sin, chaos, and disaster. But behind his anger, you can hear something more human. Grief. People were mourning a world that had promised safety and suddenly disappeared. Out of that vacuum came danger. A local ruler, remembered as Vortigern, is said to have hired Saxon mercenaries to fight off raiders. 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa, led them, but inviting wolves to guard the sheep rarely ends well. More Saxons followed. Families came across the sea with their creators, their tools, and their hopes. Was it an invasion or migration? Probably both. The Britons resisted. Half-legend stories speak of a war leader, later called Arthur, who fought back. Maybe he lived, maybe he didn't. But the story of him mattered. It gave people hope in the middle of despair. From all this conflict, new kingdoms began to take shape. Kent turned its ports into power. In the north, Bernicia and Deira joined together to become Northumbria. Mercia spread across the Midlands. Wessex grew in the southwest. East Anglia thrived on its rivers. Sussex and Essex gripped the southern coast. Later, scholars would call this collection the Heptarchy. But at the time, it was just a shifting patchwork of rival realms. Their kings weren't emperors. They ruled from smoky timber halls, not marble palaces. They gave gifts, settled disputes, and led their warriors in battle. But then, something unexpected arrived. Not another army, but a Roman monk. In 597, Augustine landed in Kent with a cross in his hand. Christianity returned, and soon monasteries like Lindisfarne and Iona sprang up. These were little islands of prayer and learning, where monks copied books and kept memory alive. Slowly, the island stitched itself back together. Kings began writing laws. King Ethelbert of Kent even put prices on crimes, harsh, maybe, but better than endless feuds. In 664, church leaders met at Whitby to settle which customs they would follow. Even agreeing on the date of Easter mattered, because it gave people a sense of unity. Quiet choices like that forged bonds as strong as any sword. And this wasn't a time of darkness. It had moments of brilliance. Think of Sutton Hoo, where an Anglo-Saxon ruler was buried in a great ship, surrounded by gold, garnets, and a helmet that still stares out at us today. Life could be glittering grand, but it was also fragile. A bad harvest or a new plague could undo everything. People leaned on charms, prayers, and each other just to get through. Power kept shifting. Northumbria shone with its scholars and saints, like the monk Bede who wrote the first great history of England. Mercia rose under strong kings like Offa, who even carved a massive earthwork Offa's Dyke to mark the border with Wales. Wessex, though quieter at first, was learning, adapting, and preparing for its turn, because a new storm was gathering. Across the northern seas, longships were being carved with snarling dragon heads. Their crews were hungry for silver and glory. Soon, the Vikings would arrive, the sea wolves, who would test every weakness these young kingdoms had, but not yet. For now, imagine a timber hall lit by fire, with a poet singing of heroes while rain lashes at the door. This is where the story of medieval England begins, not with Rome's collapse, but with the stubborn rise of new rulers and new dreams. And if you're with us on this journey, help us light the next torch by hitting that like button. Let's see if we can reach 1,000 likes. Because history isn't just the past. It's a relay. Rome dropped the torch. Britain fumbled, caught it, and ran. And where that run leads to castles, kings, and wars is the story we're about to tell. Sea wolves, the Viking storm that ravaged England. They came from the cold north, from lands of deep fjords and endless summer nights. At home they were farmers and fishermen, but once they pushed their longships into the sea, they became something else. Warriors, raiders, and explorers. Today, we call them the Vikings. To the people of medieval England, they were the sea wolves' predators who could strike at any coast without warning. Picture the first thing you'd hear: waves crashing against long, narrow ships, oars cutting in perfect rhythm, and above the waterline, a carved dragon's head rising out of the mist. For villagers on the English shore, it must have been terrifying. One moment you're herding sheep, the next you see shadows on the horizon and you know the wolves have come. The first famous strike came in the year 793 at Lindisfarne, a holy island off the northeast coast. Monks were cut down, churches burned, treasures looted. Chroniclers said it was a sign of Creator's anger. But to the Vikings, it was simple opportunity. Their longships could cross oceans, but also slide up rivers. No village, no town, no monastery was safe. Raids soon became a drumbeat of fear. Every year, more ships arrived. Kings tried paying them off with silver protection money called danegeld. Sometimes it worked. Usually, it didn't. Because the Vikings weren't just chasing treasure. They wanted land. By the mid-9th century, entire families were crossing the seas with their animals and tools, ready to settle. Then came the year 865, the moment everything changed. The great heathen army landed in England. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. Northumbria fell, East Anglia fell, Mercia bent the knee. Only one kingdom remained, Wessex. And even that was hanging by a thread. From the swamps of Somerset, a young king named Alfred would rise. Alfred rebuilt armies, built forts, and even created England's first navy. For decades, battles raged. Sometimes the Vikings had the upper hand. Sometimes Alfred and his men struck back. The future of England balanced on a knife's edge. But here's the twist. The Vikings didn't just destroy, they left their mark deep in English life. Words like sky, knife, and window came from their language. Towns with names ending in by or thorpe were founded by them. Even the blood of their warriors mixed into the families of England's kings and peasants. So, who were these men really? To the monks of Lindisfarne, they were demons. To kings, they were ruthless enemies. But to history, they were something more complicated. They were a storm one that nearly broke England, but also forced it to grow stronger, tougher, and more united. The sea wolves ravaged the land, but in the end, they became part of the story they tried to conquer. And from the chaos they brought, a new dream was born, Alfred's dream of unity. A dream that would one day shape a nation. Alfred the Great's impossible dream of unity. England in the 9th century was a land on fire. Viking longships slid out of the mist like floating dragons, villages went up in flames, and kingdoms that had stood for centuries fell one by one. Northumbria was gone. East Anglia was gone. Mercia was broken. Only one kingdom was left standing in the South Wessex. And in the middle of it all was a young, sickly king named Alfred. Nobody thought he would survive. Nobody thought he could save England. Alfred became king in the year 871. He was in his early 20s, often ill, and already tired from years of fighting. He wasn't the kind of man you picture when you hear the word warrior king. But Alfred had something far more important than brute strength. He had vision and he had stubbornness. At first, things went badly. In the winter of 878, a Viking army under Guthrum launched a surprise attack. Alfred's army was crushed. His kingdom collapsed. Alfred himself had to run for his life, hiding in the marshes of Somerset. For a while, he was a king with no crown, a ruler with no land. There's a story, half legend, half truth, about this time. Alfred was staying in a peasant woman's hut, disguised and broken. She asked him to watch her bread while it baked. Lost in thought about his shattered kingdom, he let it burn. When she returned, she scolded him harshly, not knowing he was the king. That moment became a symbol of Alfred's life. Even kings have to master the small things before they can save a nation. But Alfred wasn't finished. From the swamps he began to rebuild. Slowly, men who still believed in him gathered at his side. He planned carefully, striking back in surprise raids, rebuilding his army piece by piece. And then came the turning point. The Battle of Edington. Alfred's shield wall held firm against Guthrum's warriors. For once, the Vikings were the ones who broke. Guthrum surrendered and even agreed to be baptized, symbolically bending to Alfred's faith. But Alfred's true genius wasn't just in winning battles, it was in preparing for the next ones. He knew the Vikings would be back, and he knew England couldn't survive without change. So he dreamed of something no one had ever achieved before, a united English kingdom. He started with defence. Alfred ordered the building of fortified towns, called burhs. These were strongholds, spaced so carefully that no village was more than a day's walk from safety. If the Vikings attacked, people could run to the nearest burh and fight back. It was a network of safety, one that gave the people of Wessex a sense of hope. He also reorganized his army. Instead of calling all men to fight at once, he created a system where one group fought while another stayed home to farm. That way, his people could both defend themselves and survive the winter. He even built a navy small at first, but it was England's first real fleet. Alfred knew that to defeat sea wolves, you needed teeth in the water. And Alfred didn't stop with war. He believed knowledge was as powerful as the sword. He encouraged education, ordering that important books be translated into English so ordinary people, not just monks, could read them. He even worked on some translations himself. He believed that a strong kingdom needed not only soldiers, but also wisdom and faith. Still, Alfred never saw his dream fully come true. The Vikings still controlled huge parts of England under the Danelaw. Wessex was stronger than before, but it was still only one kingdom. Yet Alfred had done something far more important than conquering land. He had planted an idea. The idea that one day all the English kingdoms could be united under one crown, that idea didn't die with him. His children and grandchildren carried it forward, fighting battle after battle until England finally became one nation. And when people looked back, they saw Alfred as the first builder of that dream. That's why history remembers him not just as Alfred, but as Alfred the Great. He wasn't the strongest, or the fiercest, or the most obvious hero. But in the darkest moment, when England was one defeat away from disappearing, Alfred imagined something greater and refused to let go. His impossible dream of unity would echo through centuries, shaping the nation that still carries his legacy today. And yet, the dream would face its greatest test less than 200 years later in the year 1066, when an army from across the sea landed to take the crown of England in a single bloody battle. 1066. The day England was conquered in a single battle. The year was 1066. England was rich, powerful, and full of ambition, but it was also standing on a trapdoor. One king's death would open that trap, and in just a few months the entire future of the country would be rewritten. 3 men wanted the crown. Only one would wear it. And the battle that decided it all became one of the most famous days in history. It began in January. King Edward the Confessor, who had ruled for over 20 years, died without leaving an heir. His death set off a storm. The first claimant was Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful nobleman. He was chosen by the English council and crowned king almost immediately. But across the sea, others had their eyes on the crown. Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, claimed it through an old promise, and William, Duke of Normandy, insisted Edward had once promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support him. 3 men, 3 armies, and 1 throne. The first to strike was Hardrada. That September, he sailed from Norway with hundreds of longships, joined by Harold's own brother, Tostig, who had betrayed his family. They stormed into northern England, burning towns and seizing land. For Harold Godwinson, this was a nightmare. But instead of waiting, he did the unthinkable. He forced his army to march nearly 200 miles in under a week, pushing them to exhaustion. At Stamford Bridge, Harold's men caught the Vikings off guard. The battle was brutal, and Hardrada, the giant of Norway, was cut down. Tostig fell beside him. The Viking Age, which had tormented England for centuries, effectively ended that day. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's men were battered, bloodied, and far from ready for what came next. Because even as they celebrated in the north, news arrived. William of Normandy had landed in the south, with his army of knights, archers, and horses. Harold had no choice. He turned his army around and forced them on another exhausting march, all the way back to meet this new threat. On October 14th, the 2 armies faced each other near Hastings. Harold's men took the high ground, forming a great wall of shields, shoulder to shoulder, axe and spear ready. William's Normans charged uphill again and again, but the wall held. For hours the English stood strong. Every charge smashed against them and broke like waves on rock. But battles are decided by moments. At one point, parts of William's army panicked and retreated. Seeing this, some of Harold's men broke formation and chased them downhill. It was a deadly mistake. The Normans wheeled around, cutting them off. The shield wall was no longer unbroken. Now William had his chance. The fighting dragged on all day. By late afternoon, the English line was weakening. Then came the fatal blow. Legend says an arrow struck King Harold in the eye. Others say he was hacked down by Norman knights. However it happened, the result was the same. Their king was dead. The English line collapsed. As the sun set, the battlefield was covered in bodies. The Saxon army was shattered, and William had won. Just 2 months earlier, England had beaten back the Vikings. Now, in a single day, it had been conquered by the Normans. By Christmas, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. A new era had begun. The Normans built castles of stone, imposed new laws, and changed the language itself. French words fused with English, shaping the way we still speak today. The old Anglo-Saxon world was gone, swept away by one battle, one day, one arrow. 1066 is more than a date in a textbook. It's the moment England's destiny turned. Everything that came after the castles, the wars, even the English language you're hearing right now traces back to that hill near Hastings. And here's the haunting thought. It all hinged on a single day. One man's death, one broken line, one battle that decided the future of a nation. Castles of stone. William's iron grip on a broken land. When William the Conqueror won at Hastings in 1066, the battle ended, but his problems had only just begun. England wasn't a prize that would sit quietly in his hand. It was a land full of angry lords, proud traditions, and people who had no reason to accept a foreign duke as their king. If William wanted to keep his crown, he had to do something no English ruler had ever done before: cover the land with stone. At first, William's hold on power was shaky. He had beaten Harold on the battlefield, but all across England, rebellions sparked like dry grass catching fire. In the north, the old nobility rose against him. In the west, Saxon lords plotted to throw him out. Even London itself was restless. William needed a way to crush rebellion before it started to make everyone feel his presence, even when his army wasn't there. His answer was the castle. Not just one or two, but dozens, then hundreds. Imagine it. You live in a small village, your wooden houses leaning in the wind, when suddenly foreign builders arrive. They drive stakes into the ground, raise wooden towers on earth mounds, and surround them with ditches and palisades. Then, one day, the wooden tower is replaced by stone. Huge blocks rise skyward, walls thicker than a man is tall. This wasn't just a building. It was a message. The Normans are here, and they are not leaving. The Tower of London began as one of these fortresses, a cold, looming symbol of William's power, built right in the heart of the English capital. It wasn't designed to be pretty. It was designed to intimidate. Every stone, every arrow slit, every towering wall shouted the same thing: resist, and you'll be crushed. But the castles weren't only symbols, they were tools. From inside their walls, Norman knights could ride out to smash uprisings, control trade routes, and enforce new laws. Rebellions that once might have spread like wildfire now ran straight into stone walls. The English learned quickly. You could burn a village, but you couldn't burn a castle. William also reshaped the very land through a massive survey called the Domesday Book. It listed every piece of land, every ox, every acre, and who owned it. This wasn't just about taxes. It was about control. England became a kingdom on paper, ruled by Norman lords who lived in castles and owed everything to the king. For ordinary people, life changed fast. Castles meant soldiers living nearby, roads blocked, and constant reminders that the Normans were in charge. To the Saxons, these fortresses felt like cages dropped from the sky, trapping their old freedoms beneath stone. But for William, they were lifelines. Without them, his rule might have crumbled as quickly as it was won. And yet, the castles also became part of England's identity. Over time, markets grew around their walls, villages turned into towns. What began as symbols of fear became the heart of communities. Even today, ruins of those Norman castles still stand, their towers cracked but unbroken, reminders of the moment England was remade. William's genius wasn't just winning Hastings, it was realizing that battles are only the beginning. To rule a conquered land, you don't just need swords, you need stone, you need fear, you need permanence. The castles of Norman England were all of these things. So when you look at those grey ruins today, don't just see ancient walls. See the iron grip of a conqueror who understood that if he couldn't hold England with loyalty, he would hold it with castles. And for better or worse, it worked. William turned conquest into control and control into a kingdom that would last. The age of wooden halls was over. The age of stone had begun. The king who vanished in the forest. William II's suspicious death. On a summer's day in the year 1100, King William II, better known as William Rufus, rode out into the New Forest for a hunt. By nightfall, he was lying dead on the ground with an arrow in his chest. Officially, it was called an accident. But was it really? Or was it one of the most convenient assassinations in English history? William Rufus had never been a popular king. He was the third son of William the Conqueror. Fiery-haired, hot-tempered, and known for his sharp tongue and harsher rule. Chroniclers said he taxed the church heavily, mocked religion, and quarrelled constantly with his barons. To many, he was greedy, arrogant, and cruel. If a king was ever going to make enemies, it was William Rufus. And by 1100, he had plenty of them. The New Forest itself already carried a dark reputation. It had been created by William the Conqueror, who cleared villages and forced people from their homes to make way for royal hunting grounds. Locals whispered it was cursed. In fact, 2 of William Rufus's brothers had already died there under strange circumstances. So when Rufus rode into the woods that day, it was a dangerous place in more ways than one. He was joined by a hunting party, including a knight named Walter Tyrrell. At some point during the hunt, the group split up. Then, a single arrow struck the king in the chest. Tyrrell was said to be the archer. Some chroniclers claim he fled immediately to France, never looking back. Others insist it truly was an accident, that Tyrrell shot at a deer and the arrow glanced off a tree before striking the king. But how likely is that? A deadly arrow, perfectly placed, hitting the king's chest by mistake. What makes the story even more suspicious is what happened next. News of William's death spread fast, but instead of mourning or calling for justice, many in his circle seemed strangely calm. His younger brother Henry wasted no time. While the king's body was still lying in the forest, Henry raced to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and declared himself king. He was crowned within days. Think about that. The king is dead in the woods, an arrow in his chest, and before his body is even cold, his brother is wearing the crown. If that doesn't look suspicious, what does? Some historians argue it really was just a freak hunting accident. After all, archery was dangerous and accidents happened. But others see the fingerprints of conspiracy. Henry had the most to gain. Tyrell, the supposed shooter, conveniently vanished. And the church, who had hated Rufus, didn't push too hard for answers. For his enemies, William's sudden death was almost too perfect. Even the way his body was treated adds to the mystery. Rufus was left lying where he fell until a peasant cart carried him away. No great procession, no honour. For a king, it was humiliating, almost as if people were glad to see him gone. So, was William Rufus murdered? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. But the timing, the location, the people involved, it all leaves the story dripping with suspicion. If it was an accident, it was the most convenient accident in medieval history. If it was a plot, it was one of the cleanest hits ever pulled off against a king. What we do know is that his death changed everything. Henry I took the throne, reshaped the crown's power, and secured his dynasty. William Rufus became little more than a bloody mystery in the forest, a king who vanished not in battle, but in the quiet rustle of trees and the flight of a single arrow. So the question lingers, even 900 years later, was William Rufus unlucky? Or was he silenced? In the New Forest, the trees still stand, silent witnesses to a crime or an accident that turned the course of English history. An empire of Angevins. Power stretched across the seas. By the middle of the 12th century, England wasn't just England anymore. It was the beating heart of something far bigger, an empire that stretched across seas, swallowed up half of France, and was ruled by one of the most ruthless dynasties medieval Europe had ever seen, the Angevins. Their rise turned England from a conquered kingdom into a superpower. But like all empires built on ambition, it carried the seeds of its own destruction. It began with a marriage. Henry, Count of Anjou, a fiery young noble with endless energy, wed Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women in history. Eleanor had been Queen of France, but she divorced her husband and married Henry, bringing with her the vast duchy of Aquitaine. Overnight, Henry controlled more French land than the French king himself. When he became King Henry II of England in 1154, he didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited an empire. This Angevin empire stretched from the wild borders of Ireland to the Pyrenees Mountains. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Gascony, parts of Wales and Ireland, all of it tied together under one family. It wasn't a neat empire like Rome, with capitals and order. It was a patchwork stitched together with castles, oaths, and fear. But its sheer size made it one of the most powerful realms in Europe. Henry II was a king who never stopped moving. He was known to travel constantly, riding from one end of his domains to the other, always inspecting, always judging, never resting. He reformed English law, sending royal judges across the land to make sure the king's justice reached even the smallest village. These reforms planted the roots of the common law that still exists today. But Henry's rule wasn't just about law. It was about power, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Nowhere is this clearer than in his feud with Thomas Becket, his own Archbishop of Canterbury. Once friends, they turned bitter enemies when Becket defended the church against the crown. Henry's rage boiled over until knights, thinking they were acting on his wishes, murdered Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral. The shocking killing turned Becket into a saint and Henry into a king stained by guilt. Then came the family drama. The Angevins weren't just rulers, they were a storm that raged even within their own bloodline. Henry's sons rebelled against him more than once, backed by Eleanor herself. Imagine it, the Queen of England siding with her children against her husband. Civil wars tore at the empire, and even Henry, with all his energy, couldn't always hold it together. After Henry came his son, Richard, remembered as Richard the Lionheart. He spent much of his reign away on crusade, earning fame as a warrior but leaving England almost as an afterthought. Behind him stood his brother John, who would later become infamous as one of England's most hated kings. The Angevin story is a tale of glory and rot, side-by-side victories abroad, but betrayal, rebellion, and resentment at home. Still, at its height, the Angevin Empire was extraordinary. Picture it. An English king commanding knights in France, taxing trade in Gascony, planning campaigns in Ireland, and sparring with popes in Rome. For a brief moment, England wasn't an island kingdom on the edge of Europe. It was Europe's heavyweight, feared by rivals and resented by subjects. But here's the catch. The empire was never truly secure. It depended on loyalty that could be bought or broken in an instant. The French kings waited patiently, watching the Angevin family tear itself apart, ready to pick up the pieces. And piece by piece, the empire slipped away. Normandy fell. Anjou was lost. By the end of John's reign, much of the empire Henry had built was gone. The Angevins had reached higher than anyone imagined, but like all flames that burn too brightly, they burned out quickly. What they left behind was a lesson. Power stretched across seas can be dazzling, but it can also be fragile. Still, for a shining moment, England wasn't just a kingdom. It was the core of a sprawling empire, a restless giant that changed law, challenged the church, and carved its name into Europe. The Angevins were conquerors, builders, and destroyers, and their story would pave the way for legends of Richard the Lionheart, of King John, and of the Magna Carta that would force kings to kneel. Richard the Lionheart. Warrior king or reckless crusader? When you hear the name Richard the Lionheart, you probably picture a shining knight in armor, a king charging into battle with a sword raised high, the perfect image of medieval chivalry. And yes, Richard I of England has been remembered for centuries as one of the most heroic kings in history. But the truth? It's not so simple. Some saw him as the ultimate warrior king. Others thought he was a reckless adventurer who abandoned his kingdom and bled it dry. So which was he, lion or liability? Richard came to the throne in 1189. He was tall, handsome, and already famous as a warrior. Even as a teenager, he had led armies against his own father, Henry II. He was ruthless, ambitious, and fearless in battle. To his knights, he was the kind of leader who fought in the front line, swinging his sword alongside them. To his enemies, he was terrifying. And almost immediately after becoming king, he set his sights on the greatest adventure of his age, the Crusades. The Third Crusade was Richard's chance to prove himself. He joined forces with kings of Europe to take back Jerusalem from the legendary Muslim leader Saladin. The clash between the two became one of the most famous rivalries in history. And in many ways, Richard lived up to the legend. At the Siege of Acre, he showed his ruthless side, ordering thousands of Muslim prisoners executed when negotiations broke down. At the Battle of Arsuf, he led his army with such skill and courage that even Saladin supposedly admired him. Richard never captured Jerusalem, but he fought Saladin to a standstill and secured a deal that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy City. Back home, news of his victories made him a legend. Songs and stories turned him into a hero, the Lionheart whose roar echoed across Christendom. But here's the other side of the story. Richard spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. To him, the island was just a bank to fund his wars. He even admitted he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Taxes were squeezed from the people, land was sold off, and the kingdom was drained to pay for his endless campaigns abroad. And then came his capture. On his way home from the Crusade, Richard was kidnapped by the Duke of Austria and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. England was forced to pay a colossal ransom to free him, the kind of money that nearly bankrupted the kingdom. While peasants starved, their king sat in a foreign prison, paying the price for his glory. Even his death showed the contradiction in his character. In 1199, Richard was besieging a minor castle in France. Hardly the heroic battlefield you'd expect for the Lionheart. A crossbow bolt struck him, and days later, infection killed him. The mighty Crusader king, gone because of a petty fight over treasure. So, how should we see Richard today? Was he the fearless warrior king who made England famous across the world? Or the reckless crusader who cared more for his pride than his people? Maybe he was both. He was brave, brilliant, and larger than life, but also selfish, absent, and blind to the cost of his adventures. One thing is certain. Richard left behind a legend bigger than the man himself. In stories, he became the noble king who fought for the Creator and glory, the friend of Robin Hood, the symbol of English courage. But behind the myth stood a king who treated England like a purse, who died far from home, and whose legacy left his brother John to inherit a kingdom weakened and resentful. The Lionheart still roars in memory, but history whispers another truth. Sometimes the greatest heroes are also the greatest gamblers. And Richard the Lionheart gambled England's future on a dream of conquest. Whether he was a glorious warrior or a reckless crusader depends on which story you choose to believe. King John, England's most hated monarch, or history's scapegoat? Say the name King John, and most people think of a villain, the greedy tyrant in Robin Hood stories, the coward who lost everything, the king so bad that his own barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta. For centuries, he has worn the crown of England's most hated monarch. But here's the twist. Was he really the monster history makes him out to be, or just the perfect scapegoat for a kingdom in chaos? John became king in the year 1199, after the death of his famous brother, Richard the Lionheart. He was the youngest son of Henry II, never meant to rule. Even his nickname, John Lackland, was a cruel reminder that his father hadn't given him much inheritance. But fate has a funny way of playing games, and suddenly John held the crown of England, and the impossible legacy of his warrior brother. Right from the start, John had problems. His empire stretched across the Channel into France, but the French king, Philip II, was determined to tear it away. John made enemies fast. He married Isabella of Angoulême, stealing her from another nobleman and sparking outrage. He quarrelled with his barons, who saw him as untrustworthy. Worst of all, he faced Philip in battle and lost. By 1214, almost all the rich Angevin lands in France were gone. Normandy, Anjou, Poitou, the heart of the empire his father built, slipped from his grasp. To the nobles, this was unforgivable. Kings were supposed to win, not lose. But John's troubles didn't stop with France. He fought bitterly with the Church. When the Pope tried to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury, John refused. The result? England was placed under an interdict. Churches closed, sacraments denied, bells silenced. Imagine living in a world where, for years, marriages couldn't be blessed, funerals couldn't be held, and everyone believed their souls were in danger, all because of their king. In the end, John backed down and even agreed to make England a vassal state of the Pope, paying tribute like a servant. For many, it was another humiliation. And then there were his taxes. To pay for wars and ransoms, John squeezed his people harder than any king before him. Nobles, merchants, even peasants groaned under the weight of his demands. The more he took, the more they hated him. Chroniclers called him cruel, greedy, even a devil. Rumours swirled that he murdered his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, to secure his throne. Whether true or not, it only deepened his dark legend. But here's where the story gets tricky. Some of John's reforms were actually smart. He reorganised the justice system, made government more efficient, and kept detailed financial records that historians still admire today. He wasn't lazy or incompetent, he was clever, calculating, and always working. But cleverness isn't the same as charisma, and John had none. Where his brother Richard inspired loyalty, John inspired resentment. By 1215 his barons had had enough. They rose in rebellion, marching against their king. John was forced to the meadow of Runnymede, where he put his seal on a document that would echo through history. Magna Carta. It demanded that the king respect the rights of his nobles, consult them on taxes, and follow the law. At the time, it was meant to limit John, but in the centuries that followed, it became the foundation for constitutional government and liberty. Ironically, the king most hated in his own age ended up shaping the very freedoms people still fight for today. John didn't enjoy his defeat for long. He tried to fight back, but in 1216, while fleeing his enemies, he lost much of his treasure in a tidal estuary. Some say it still lies buried in the mud. Soon after, he fell sick with dysentery and died, leaving behind a broken kingdom and a reputation blacker than night. So, was King John truly England's worst monarch? Or was he simply the perfect villain for barons, bishops, and chroniclers who needed someone to blame? Maybe he was both ruthless, unlucky, ambitious, and deeply flawed. A man who failed in wars, failed in charm, but left behind one of the most important documents in human history. In the end, King John's story is the ultimate paradox. The king everyone despised may also be the king who, by accident, gave the world the idea that no ruler is above the law. Hated in life, cursed in legend, but remembered forever. Magna Carta. The day a king was forced to kneel. Picture the scene. It's the summer of 1215, and the King of England, the most powerful man in the realm, is standing on a meadow by the River Thames. His face is red with anger, his hands shaking with rage, but he has no choice. Around him are armed barons, men who were once his loyal subjects but now treat him like an enemy. In front of him lies a document that will change history. This was the day King John was forced to kneel. This was the birth of Magna Carta. For years, John had been bleeding England dry. His wars in France had ended in humiliating defeat. Normandy was lost, and with it, the pride of the nobility. To fund his failures, John taxed his people mercilessly. Nobles were fined outrageous sums, towns were squeezed for cash, even widows were forced to pay just to avoid being married off again. The king's greed seemed endless. And then there was his clash with the church. By defying the Pope, John left England under an interdict, churches closed and souls in limbo. Even when he made peace, he agreed to pay tribute to the Pope, making England look weak. To his barons, This was the final insult. By 1215, the anger had boiled over. The barons armed themselves and openly rebelled. They didn't just want to complain, they wanted to break the king's power. John tried to fight back, but too many had turned against him. He was cornered. And so, on June 15th, he met them at a meadow called Runnymede. There he faced a choice. War he could not win, or a deal that would humiliate him forever. Magna Carta Latin for Great Charter was that deal. On its surface, it was a list of demands. No unfair taxes without the barons' consent, no imprisonment without trial, protection of church rights, and limits on royal power. In short, it was the first time in English history that the king's authority was openly challenged and put in writing. John, fuming, had to place his royal seal on it. For the barons, it was victory. For John, it was humiliation. But here's the twist. John never intended to keep his word. Within weeks, he wrote to the Pope, claiming he had signed the charter under duress. The Pope agreed and declared Magna Carta invalid. John immediately went back on everything he had promised, plunging the kingdom into civil war. Once again, England was torn apart by its own king. Yet despite John's betrayal, Magna Carta refused to die. The barons and the church reissued it after John's death, trimming it down but keeping its core promise that no ruler could stand above the law. Over the centuries, its clauses inspired rebels, reformers, and even revolutionaries. From the English Civil War to the American Declaration of Independence, echoes of Magna Carta rang out whenever people demanded freedom. Back in 1215, though, it wasn't about democracy or human rights. It was about angry nobles protecting their privileges from a greedy king. Ordinary peasants weren't suddenly free. Most of the charter dealt with barons' rights, land disputes, and feudal obligations. And yet, out of this selfish fight between nobles and king, came one of the most powerful ideas in history: that rulers have limits and subjects have rights. So how should we see that day at Runnymede? Was it the moment freedom was born, or just a group of rich men forcing their king to share power? Maybe it was both. What started as a feud over money and land became a cornerstone of liberty. The sight of a king bowing to his barons planted a seed that would grow for centuries. Magna Carta didn't make John a better king. He remained hated until his death the following year. But it made England a different kingdom, one where even kings had to answer to the law. That's why, over 800 years later, Magna Carta is still remembered not just as parchment and ink, but as a turning point in the struggle between power and people. On that meadow by the Thames, a furious king bent to his barons' demands. He thought it was a temporary humiliation. History turned it into something far greater. The day tyranny met its first real chain. Edward I, the hammer who tried to crush the Scots. Edward I of England had many titles: king, reformer, builder of castles. But the one that stuck hardest, the one whispered with both fear and fury, was Hammer of the Scots. To his supporters, he was a strong ruler who brought law and order to England. To his enemies, he was a ruthless conqueror, determined to break Scotland under his iron heel. His story is one of ambition, brutality, and a fight for freedom that would echo through centuries. Edward came to the throne in 1272, a towering figure, well over 6 feet tall, a giant for his time. He had already fought in the Crusades and earned a reputation as a fierce warrior. As king, he moved quickly to strengthen his grip. He reformed English law, built a system of courts and even summoned parliaments that gave nobles and townsmen a voice. But while he built order at home, his eyes were fixed on conquest abroad. First, Edward turned to Wales. The Welsh princes had resisted English rule for generations, but Edward was relentless. He built massive stone castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech fortresses so imposing that they still dominate the landscape today. After years of fighting, he crushed Welsh resistance and declared his son the Prince of Wales, a title English heirs to the throne still carry. For Edward, this was only the beginning. His real obsession was Scotland. When the Scottish king died without an heir in 1290, the nobles asked Edward to help choose the next ruler. He agreed, but only if Scotland recognised him as overlord. It was a trap. Once inside, Edward began tightening his grip, demanding obedience and treating Scotland like a vassal state. When the Scots resisted, Edward unleashed his fury. He invaded with fire and sword, sacking towns, tearing down defences, and dragging the Stone of Destiny, Scotland's ancient coronation stone, to Westminster as a trophy. To many Scots, this was unforgivable, an insult that burned deeper than any wound. Resistance soon rose. At first, it was Andrew de Moray and William Wallace who led a daring uprising. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the Scots humiliated Edward's forces, cutting down knights in the mud and proving that even the mighty English could bleed. Wallace became a legend, the face of freedom, but Edward was not a man to forgive. He returned with overwhelming force. At Falkirk in 1298, his longbowmen tore through Scottish lines, and Wallace was forced to flee. Later, Wallace was captured and executed in London, his body hacked apart, his head displayed on London Bridge. Edward thought the rebellion was finished. He was wrong. A new leader rose, Robert the Bruce. At first, Bruce had sworn loyalty to Edward, but ambition and patriotism drove him to claim the Scottish crown. Edward called him a traitor and swore to crush him. The war turned brutal. Villages were burned, prisoners slaughtered, entire regions left in ashes. To the Scots, Edward became a monster. To the English, he was a king defending his rightful overlordship. By 1307, Edward was old, sick, and worn down by decades of war, but he refused to give up. Even on his deathbed, he ordered his bones to be carried into Scotland so he could continue the fight after death. He never made it. He died on campaign, leaving his son Edward II to inherit the war. The Scots would soon rise again and win their greatest victory at Bannockburn. So who was Edward I? Was he the strong king who gave England stable laws and parliaments? Or the ruthless conqueror who left Scotland drenched in blood? The answer is both. His ambition built, but it also destroyed. His castles stand as marvels of engineering, but also as monuments to oppression. His reforms shaped England's government, but his wars left scars that still echo in the story of Scotland. To his admirers, he was the hammer of the Scots, a king who bent nations to his will. To his enemies, he was the tyrant who tried to crush their freedom. And in the end, maybe that's the truest legacy of Edward I. A man who ruled with iron, whose hammer blows built an empire, but also forged a rebellion strong enough to outlast him. Edward II, betrayed by his queen, destroyed by his enemies. If Edward I was remembered as the hammer of the Scots, then his son, Edward II, was remembered for something very different: weakness, scandal, and one of the most shocking downfalls in English history. his story is not one of glorious battles or mighty castles, but of betrayal. Betrayal by his barons, by his favourites, and most famously by his own queen. Edward II became king in 1307, inheriting his father's wars and his towering reputation. But Edward was nothing like the ruthless warrior who came before him. He was softer, more interested in hobbies like rowing, music, and, most controversially, the company of men. Chroniclers claimed he loved ordinary companions, especially a knight named Piers Gaveston, far more than he loved the business of ruling. Whether or not their bond was romantic, one thing was certain. Edward showered Gaveston with titles and riches, making him hated by the great barons of the realm. The tension was immediate. The nobles expected a strong king who would lead them in war. Instead, they saw a man distracted by favourites and blind to his enemies' growing anger. Gaveston was exiled, recalled, and exiled again, each time sparking more outrage. Finally, in 1312, the barons took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured and brutally executed. For Edward, it was a wound he never forgave. For his enemies, it was a warning. The king's authority could be challenged. Then came Scotland. Edward tried to continue his father's war, but it was a disaster. At Bannockburn in 1314, the English army, far larger and better equipped, was humiliated by Robert the Bruce and his outnumbered Scots. Knights drowned in ditches, horses stumbled on rough ground, and Edward himself barely escaped. The defeat shattered England's reputation and made Edward look weak at the very moment he needed strength. His answer was to find new favourites. Hugh Despenser and his family became the next Gavestons, clinging to power, grabbing land, and enraging the nobility. The barons, furious, rose in rebellion again. England descended into chaos, civil war breaking out as nobles fought both the king and his greedy allies. But the worst blow didn't come from the barons. It came from someone far closer, Queen Isabella. Isabella of France had once been a loyal consort, but years of neglect and humiliation turned her against Edward. Sent to France to negotiate peace, she refused to return. Instead, she allied with Roger Mortimer, a powerful rebel noble and her lover. Together, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army, landed in England, and declared open war on the king. Edward's support collapsed overnight. Nobles flocked to Isabella's banner, sick of Edward's failures. The king fled with the Despensers, but they were captured. Hugh Despenser was executed in one of the most gruesome deaths of the Middle Ages, dragged, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. Edward himself was taken prisoner, betrayed not just by his enemies, but by the woman who was supposed to be his queen. In 1327, Edward II became the first English king forced to abdicate. His young son was crowned Edward III, while Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents. The once mighty king was locked away in Berkeley Castle. What happened next remains one of history's most controversial mysteries. Chroniclers whispered that Edward was murdered in secret, his death hidden behind castle walls. The most infamous story claims he was killed with a red-hot poker, a brutal punishment meant to mock his rumoured relationships with men. But many historians doubt this, suggesting instead that he may have been quietly smothered. Whatever the truth, Edward II vanished, his life ending not on a battlefield, but in a prison cell, betrayed and destroyed. So who was Edward II? Was he a weak fool, unfit to wear the crown of his warrior father? Or was he simply a man out of place, crushed by barons who couldn't tolerate a king who didn't fit their mould. Perhaps he was both reckless and naive, but also a tragic figure, undone not only by his enemies, but by the woman closest to him. What is certain is that Edward II's reign showed how fragile kingship could be. The crown was supposed to be untouchable, ordained by the Creator, but one unhappy queen, one ambitious noble, and one humiliated king proved that even monarchs could fall. A parliament for the people, or just another cage for kings. Picture a king on his throne. The crown is heavy, the sceptre gleams, but surrounding him is something far more dangerous than swords or armies. Words. Around him sit bishops, nobles, and, for the first time, ordinary men chosen to speak for towns and counties. This gathering had a name, Parliament. To later generations, it would be remembered as the beginning of democracy. But to the kings who faced it, Parliament was often less a voice of the people and more a cage, a way to trap royal power, one law at a time. The roots of Parliament stretch back to the 13th century. Kings of England had long called councils of nobles and bishops to advise them. But the system was simple. The king asked. They obeyed. That balance began to change with King John and the Magna Carta in 1215. For the first time, a king had been forced to accept limits. His barons demanded that he consult them before raising new taxes. That small line in the Charter cracked the door open for something revolutionary, the idea that kings couldn't rule alone. But it was under John's son, Henry III, that things got truly messy. Henry loved art, lavish projects, and foreign advisors, all of it paid for with English money. His barons grew furious. Led by Simon de Montfort, they rebelled against him. And in 1265, they called something extraordinary. A parliament not only of nobles and bishops, but also of knights and townsmen. For the first time, common voices echoed in the halls of power. Was this democracy? Not exactly. Most people still had no vote, and the men who attended were there to protect their own local interests, not to speak for every peasant in the fields. But it was a step, and a dangerous one. Kings who once ruled unchecked now had to face the possibility that they might be outnumbered in their own councils. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, understood this better than anyone. He was a warrior, but also a shrewd politician. In 1295, he summoned what's often called the Model Parliament. Alongside lords and bishops, it included representatives from towns and counties across England. Edward didn't do this out of kindness. He needed money for his endless wars, and he realised that if people gave their consent to taxation through Parliament, they'd be less likely to rebel later. In other words, Parliament became a tool to make taxes legal and rebellion harder. A clever trick, but one that made the institution permanent. From then on, English kings had a problem. Whenever they needed money, which was often they had to call Parliament, and Parliament didn't just hand over cash, it attached conditions. Respect our rights, listen to our grievances, agree to new laws. With every meeting, Parliament's voice grew louder, and the king's authority grew smaller. This shift was thrilling but also dangerous. For some, it looked like the beginning of government by the people. For others, it looked like a slow strangling of monarchy. Kings bristled at being lectured. Nobles saw a chance to clip the crown's wings. Ordinary representatives, many from small towns, found themselves pulled into debates over national policy. England's political future was being forged in arguments, bargains, and threats. But let's not romanticize it too much. This wasn't the House of Commons we know today, with speeches about liberty and equality. The early parliaments were rough, self-serving, and often corrupt. Nobles wanted to protect their lands, merchants wanted better trade deals, towns wanted relief from taxes. If it meant limiting the king's power, so be it, but the goal was survival, not ideology. And yet, the symbolism mattered. A king surrounded by his subjects, forced to listen and negotiate, sent a message that echoed far beyond the hall. It told everyone watching that power was no longer a one-way street. For Edward II, this reality became a nightmare. Weak and unpopular, he faced Parliament not as a partner, but as an enemy. His barons used it to demand reforms, to exile his favourites, and finally to push him off the throne entirely. When he was forced to abdicate, Parliament was the weapon used against him, a cage closing in until even a king could not escape. So what was Parliament in these early centuries? A voice of the people? Hardly. Most people never set foot near its halls, but it was something new, something fragile but powerful. It was a space where kings had to compromise, where nobles could demand accountability, and where townsmen could begin to shape national policy. Over time, that cage became stronger. Future kings would try to break free, some with swords, some with clever politics, but none could ever put the genie back in the bottle. Parliament, once born, could not be killed. When we look back, it's tempting to see it as the start of democracy, the moment when ordinary people first gained a voice. In truth, it was more complicated. It was a tool of the powerful, a stage for negotiation, and a leash on kings. But even if it wasn't born perfect, it planted an idea that even monarchs had to share power, and that idea would grow. Centuries later, it would fuel revolutions, topple kings, and inspire governments around the world. But in its earliest days, Parliament was less about freedom for the people and more about survival for the realm. So, was it a parliament for the people, or just another cage for kings? The answer might be both. To kings, it was a trap. To nobles, it was protection. To towns, it was opportunity. And to history, it was the beginning of something much larger than any of them could imagine. The spark that lit the 100 Years' War. Wars don't usually begin with a single spark. They smoulder for years, fed by grudges, greed, and pride. But in 1337, one spark did set all of Europe ablaze. That spark was a claim to a crown, and it ignited a conflict that would last more than a century. This is how the 100 Years' War began. Not as a sudden clash of swords, but as a slow brewing storm of ambition, insult, and opportunity. The story starts with the kings of France and England. For centuries, English rulers had held lands inside France, stretching back to William the Conqueror, who had been Duke of Normandy before he became King of England. Generations later, the powerful Angevin dynasty had ruled not only England but also half of France. By the time of King Edward III in the 14th century, much of that empire was gone, stripped away by French kings who wanted to push the English back across the Channel. Still, England clung to lands in Gascony, a wealthy wine-producing region in southwestern France. France wanted it badly. Then came the crisis. In 1328, the French king Charles IV died without a son. Who should inherit the French throne? According to French tradition, the crown could only pass through the male line. That meant Edward III of England, grandson of a French king through his mother, was rejected. Instead, the French nobles handed the crown to Philip VI, a cousin. To Edward, this was an insult. He believed his bloodline gave him just as strong a claim, maybe even stronger. At first, Edward played along. He did homage to Philip for his lands in Gascony, swallowing his pride to keep the peace. But the rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Tensions grew worse when France supported Scotland, England's old enemy. Edward saw this as betrayal. To him, France wasn't just trying to dominate Gascony, it was trying to strangle England itself. In 1337, Edward made his move. He declared that he, not Philip VI, was the rightful king of France. It was a bold claim, and one few in France took seriously. But it gave Edward a justification for war. This wasn't just about Gascony anymore. It was about crowns, legitimacy, and pride. The spark had been struck. But why did this claim lead to such a long and brutal war? The answer lies in the ambitions of both kingdoms. France was the richest, most populous realm in Europe, but it was divided by powerful nobles who often ignored their king. England was smaller, but more united under a determined monarch. Edward realized that if he could play on French divisions, he might actually pull off the impossible, take the French crown. For Philip, allowing Edward to challenge his rule was unthinkable. A foreign king wearing France's crown would be a humiliation worse than death. And so the war began. The early campaigns set the tone. Raids, sieges, and clashes that devastated towns and fields. In 1346, Edward's outnumbered army faced the French at Crécy. There, English longbowmen changed the face of warfare, cutting down waves of French knights. It was a stunning victory, one that proved this wasn't going to be a quick fight. Yet even in these early days, the 100 Years' War was more than battles. It was a struggle of identity. For the French, it became a fight to protect their kingdom from foreign domination. For the English, it became a fight not only for territory but also for prestige. Every victory was proof that their claim was just. Every defeat threatened their pride. And beneath it all, ordinary people suffered most. Fields were burned, villages destroyed, and families uprooted. The war wasn't just knights and banners, it was hunger, plague, and despair spreading across two kingdoms. Looking back, it's tempting to say the 100 Years' War began with Edward's bold claim in 1337. But really, it was the product of centuries of rivalry. England and France had been tangled together since the Norman conquest. Their kings were bound by blood, marriage, and land, but also by hatred and jealousy. The death of Charles IV simply exposed the cracks, and Edward's ambition struck the match. So was Edward III a rightful heir defending his claim? Or an ambitious king grasping at glory? Was Philip VI the legitimate ruler? Or a usurper hiding behind tradition? The truth is, both saw themselves as rightful kings, and neither could back down without losing face. In the medieval world, pride was as deadly as steel. That's how a single dispute over inheritance lit a fire that would burn for over 100 years. A war of crowns, of castles, and of kingdoms. A war that would see heroes like the Black Prince and villains in the eyes of their enemies. A war that would give rise to legends and to one teenage girl who would become its most surprising figure. But before Joan of Arc ever lifted her banner, before Agincourt was carved into legend, the 100 Years' War began with a spark between two kings who both wanted to wear the same crown. And once that spark was lit, the flames could not be put out. Agincourt, miracle victory or myth of propaganda? The morning of October 25th, 1415, was cold and wet. Mud sucked at boots, rain slicked the fields, and a small, hungry English army stood facing what looked like certain death. Across from them stretched the glittering might of France, thousands of armoured knights, banners snapping in the wind, a force so overwhelming that the English should have been crushed. And yet, by nightfall, it was the French who lay broken on the field, while King Henry V of England claimed one of the most unlikely victories in medieval history. For centuries, Agincourt has been remembered as a miracle, the triumph of the underdog, the victory of English courage and longbow skill over French pride. Shakespeare immortalized it as a story of brotherhood and destiny, a moment where Henry's rousing words turned common men into heroes. But was Agincourt truly a miracle, or has it been polished into legend by propaganda? The war itself had already been raging for decades. By 1415, the 100 Years' War had ground on for nearly 80 years, with England and France trading blows over land, crowns and pride. Henry V, newly crowned, saw his chance to revive England's fading fortunes. He invaded France, but the campaign was a disaster. His forces were sick, starving, and exhausted after a brutal siege at Harfleur. Retreat seemed the only option. The French, eager to finish him, blocked his path to safety. At Agincourt, they trapped him. The numbers were terrifying. Some chronicles say Henry had barely 6,000 men, while the French had over 20,000. Others put the gap even wider. Whatever the exact figures, the English were badly outnumbered, hemmed in by enemy cavalry and infantry that dwarfed their own. By any measure, the English should have been slaughtered. And yet, Henry had advantages the French ignored. His army, though small, was disciplined. His longbowmen, hardened by years of war, could fire a deadly storm of arrows faster than any crossbow. The battlefield itself worked in his favour too. Narrow, muddy, and hemmed by woods, it squeezed the French into a killing ground. When the fighting began, it was chaos. French knights in heavy armour charged forward, but the mud dragged them down. Horses stumbled, and the hail of arrows cut through their ranks. Those who reached the English line found themselves crushed together, unable to swing their weapons properly. Instead of overwhelming their enemies, they became a panicked mass, trampled and suffocating under their own numbers. The English counterattacked, driving their knives into gaps in armour. By the end of the day, thousands of French knights lay dead, while English casualties were shockingly low. Henry had won a stunning victory. But here's where the story gets complicated. The English hailed Agincourt as proof of divine favour, a miracle granted to a rightful king. Henry himself played the victory up, turning it into propaganda to boost morale and secure his crown at home. Later, Shakespeare's famous play sealed the image of Henry as a heroic leader inspiring ordinary men to greatness. The reality was messier. Many historians now argue that the French weren't just unlucky, they were disastrously led. Overconfident nobles ignored their own commanders, charging recklessly into terrain that guaranteed disaster. The English longbow was deadly, yes, but the mud, the narrow ground, and French arrogance mattered just as much. Agincourt was less a miracle and more a perfect storm of bad choices by one side and cold discipline by the other. There's also the darker side of Henry's victory. During the battle, he ordered the execution of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of French prisoners. Why? Fear that the captured knights might regroup if the fight turned. But the mass killing stained Henry's reputation. Was it ruthless necessity or cold-blooded cruelty? So what should we believe? Was Agincourt the ultimate underdog triumph, or was it simply spun into legend by a king who needed a story? The truth is probably both. It was a remarkable military achievement, no question. But the way it has been remembered as proof of English heroism and French incompetence owes as much to propaganda as it does to fact. What's undeniable is its impact. Agincourt gave Henry the momentum to push deeper into France. 4 years later, he signed the Treaty of Troyes, recognized as heir to the French throne and married to the French king's daughter. For a brief moment, it looked as if England had truly conquered France. But legends have long shadows. Agincourt's fame far outlasted its political results. Within a generation, Henry's gains unravelled, and France would rise again under new leaders, including a young woman who claimed to hear the voice of the Creator. Still, when we speak of medieval battles, Agincourt stands out. It was mud and arrows, blood and steel, but also myth and memory. To the English, it was destiny. To the French, it was humiliation. To history, it is both a victory and a question. Did Henry V really achieve the impossible? Or did he simply win because his enemies handed him the battle on a platter? Agincourt remains the perfect story. A king against all odds, a small army facing giants, a moment where history teetered on the edge of disaster and then flipped. Miracle or myth? It is proof of how battles aren't just fought with swords. They're fought with stories. And sometimes, the story is what lasts the longest. The Black Death. Was it the Creator's wrath or nature's fury? In the middle of the 14th century, England was already weary from war. The 100 Years' War raged on with France, draining lives and treasure. But nothing could have prepared the kingdom for what came next. It wasn't an army with banners or a king with claims. It was invisible, merciless, and unstoppable. The plague they would call the Black Death swept across England in 1348, and within just a few years it had killed nearly half the population. Imagine it. Villages empty, entire families gone, churches filled with corpses. People asked the same question again and again. Was this Almighty's punishment, or something far darker, something no prayer could stop? The disease arrived silently. Rats carrying fleas crept ashore from ships in southern ports. The fleas carried a deadly bacteria, and once it spread, there was no escape. Victims first felt fever and chills, then painful swellings called buboes in the armpits or groin. Within days, black blotches spread across the skin, lungs filled with blood, and death followed swiftly. Some died within 48 hours. To ordinary people, it looked like the wrath of the Creator itself. Panic spread faster than the disease. Priests preached that sins had angered heaven. Flagellants, men who whipped themselves in public, appeared, hoping their suffering would win mercy. Others blamed outsiders, foreigners, even the stars in the sky. But none of it stopped the dying. Towns and cities fell silent. Bells tolled constantly until even the bell ringers were dead. In London, carts rattled through the streets carrying piles of bodies to mass graves. Chroniclers wrote of dogs and pigs feeding on unburied corpses, of whole villages abandoned. To those who lived through it, the end of the world seemed close. But while faith offered one answer, nature offered another. The plague spread along trade routes, following ships and caravans. England was part of a connected medieval world, and that connection brought both riches and ruin. What people called divine punishment was, in reality, a disease spreading through human networks. Of course, No one at the time could see germs under a microscope. To them, it was a mystery, and mystery demanded explanation. Was it the air? Bad smells? Poisoned wells? Theories multiplied, but certainty never came. The consequences were staggering. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Fields lay untended because there were no peasants left to work them. Lords, desperate for labour, had to beg surviving workers to return. For the first time, peasants realised their value. Wages rose, feudal duties weakened, and the old order began to crack. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the foundations of medieval society. And yet, the reactions weren't all despair. Some turned to prayer, with new intensity, building chapels and shrines. Others turned to pleasure, reasoning that death was so near that life should be lived while it lasted. Chroniclers describe people drinking, feasting, and dancing as if tomorrow might never come, because for many, it wouldn't. Kings and nobles were not spared. The pestilence swept through castles as easily as cottages. Even the great and powerful found themselves helpless against it. Suddenly, the certainty of power, the pride of armies and crowns, meant nothing. Death came for everyone. But perhaps the strangest part of the Black Death story is what came after. Out of the horror rose new possibilities. With fewer workers, peasants gained bargaining power. When lords resisted, revolts erupted, most famously in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The plague had shifted the balance of society, planting seeds of change that would grow for centuries. So was the Black Death Almighty's wrath or nature's fury? To the people of the 14th century, it felt like both. Priests spoke of punishment for greed and sin, while others whispered of poisoned wells and foreign plots. Today, we know it was a bacterium carried by fleas and rats, spreading with terrifying speed. But perhaps both views hold a kind of truth. For those who lived, the disease felt like divine anger. For us, it shows the brutal force of nature when humanity has no defense. The Black Death didn't just kill, it reshaped the medieval world. It broke the back of feudalism, shifted power toward the common people, and changed the relationship between man, idol, and nature. It left scars in art, in literature, and in memory. Even now, centuries later, its shadow lingers in the way we fear pandemics and wonder what forces shape our lives. In the end, the Black Death was more than a disease. It was a mirror reflecting both the fragility of human life and the resilience that follows disaster. For medieval England, it was the darkest of nights. But it was also the beginning of a dawn where the old order would never return. The peasants who rose against their lords. Peasants' Revolt. In the summer of 1381, England shook with a rebellion no one saw coming. Not barons, not knights, not foreign invaders, but peasants. Men and women who had always bent their backs in the fields suddenly stood tall and demanded justice. For centuries, lords had ruled, kings had taxed, and peasants had suffered in silence. But the Black Death had changed everything. And now, the common people were ready to rise. The plague had killed nearly half of England's population just a generation earlier. With so many gone, survivors found themselves in a strange position. Their labour was valuable. Wages began to climb, and peasants started to taste the idea of a better life. But the ruling class pushed back. Laws like the Statute of Labourers tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, forcing peasants to keep working for the same pay as before. It was a cruel attempt to hold back change, and resentment grew. Then came the spark. A new poll tax was introduced, charging everyone in the kingdom, rich and poor alike. For peasants already struggling, this was the last straw. When royal tax collectors pushed too hard in Essex and Kent, mobs chased them out. Word spread like wildfire. Villages rallied together, armed with scythes, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. They weren't just angry, they were organised. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the fiery preacher John Ball, the rebels marched toward London. Ball's sermons electrified the crowds. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He cried. His words cut to the heart of it. If all people were created equal, why should lords and kings hold power over the poor? For peasants who had always been told to obey, this was revolutionary. As the rebels poured into London, chaos erupted. The great palace at Savoy, home to the powerful Duke of Lancaster, was stormed and burned. Prisons were broken open. Officials hated for corruption were hunted down and killed. For a moment, it seemed like the entire kingdom was turning upside down. Then came the fateful meeting at Smithfield. King Richard II, only 14 years old, rode out to face the rebels. He promised reforms, freedom from serfdom, and an end to unfair taxes. The peasants believed him, but their trust was betrayed. Wat Tyler, their leader, was suddenly struck down, stabbed by the mayor of London. In the confusion, Richard stepped forward, calling out that he alone would be their leader now. Some peasants, stunned and leaderless, followed his command. Others scattered. The rebellion began to unravel. Over the following weeks, promises were broken. Richard's government hunted down the rebels, executing hundreds. The dream of freedom was crushed, but the memory of the revolt lingered. For the first time in English history, ordinary men and women had risen up against their rulers, demanding equality and justice. So was the peasants' revolt a failure? In the short term, yes. Serfdom didn't vanish overnight, and the lords held on to their power. But the shock of 1381 left a scar. The ruling class realised that the common people could no longer be ignored. Over the next century, serfdom gradually faded away. Wages rose. Peasants gained more freedom of movement. The world was changing. And though the revolt was crushed, it had cracked the foundation of feudal England. The peasants' revolt wasn't just about taxes. It was about dignity. It was about a world turned upside down by plague, where the old order no longer made sense. And it was about a truth that terrified kings and nobles alike. When pushed too far, even the lowliest subjects could rise and shake a kingdom to its core. Joan of Arc, witch to England, saint to France. In the early 15th century, England seemed close to winning the 100 Years' War. After Agincourt, the French crown looked weak, divided, and almost ready to fall into English hands. But then, out of nowhere, a teenage peasant girl stepped onto the stage of history. Her name was Joan of Arc. To the French, she became a saviour. To the English, she was a dangerous witch. And, to history, she remains one of the most extraordinary figures of the Middle Ages. Joan was born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village in France. She couldn't read or write, but from an early age she claimed she heard voices, saints and angels, she said, sent by the Creator to guide her. By the time she was a teenager, France was in crisis. The English occupied large parts of the north, and the French heir, the Dauphin Charles, looked powerless. Joan believed the Creator had chosen her to save France and put Charles on the throne. Most people would have dismissed her as mad. But Joan had something rare: conviction. She convinced local officials to escort her to Charles. When she finally stood before him, dressed in simple armour, she declared that Almighty had sent her to drive out the English. Against all odds, Charles listened. In 1429, Joan rode at the head of a French army to the besieged city of Orleans. Her presence electrified the troops. Soldiers who had been demoralised for years now believed Almighty was on their side. Under Joan's leadership, the French broke the siege and drove the English back. News of the victory spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, the French had hope. But Joan didn't stop there. She pushed Charles to claim his crown. In July 1429, she stood beside him as he was crowned King Charles VII in Reims Cathedral. It was a symbolic moment that turned the tide of the war. The English were no longer facing a fractured France. They were facing a nation with renewed faith in itself. To the English, though, Joan was an insult and a threat. A peasant girl, claiming visions, leading armies against them. It was unthinkable. They mocked her as a witch, a heretic, even a devil's servant. To capture her became a matter of pride. In 1430, Joan was taken prisoner by Burgundian allies of the English. She was sold to the English and put on trial in Rouen. The trial was a sham, designed not to find the truth but to destroy her reputation. Learned churchmen grilled her with trick questions, hoping to trap her. But Joan, uneducated though she was, answered with remarkable composure. When asked if she was in Almighty's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may the Almighty put me there. If I am, may the Creator keep me there." It was the kind of answer no theologian could twist. Still, the outcome was never in doubt. In May 1431, Joan, only 19 years old, was condemned as a heretic. She was burned at the stake in Rouen. Witnesses said she faced death calmly, crying out the name of Jesus as the flames rose around her. For the English, it was supposed to be the end of her. But it wasn't. Her death only made her more powerful. Within 25 years, the Church declared her trial invalid. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. To the French, she became a symbol of courage, faith, and resistance. To the English, her defeat of their armies remained a bitter memory. So who was Joan of Arc, witch or saint? To her enemies, she was dangerous because she shattered the order of the world. A young woman commanding men, peasants defying nobles, visions defying strategy. To her people, she was proof that the Almighty had not abandoned them. Today, Joan remains both a saint to France, a witch to England, and a reminder that sometimes the course of history can be changed, not by kings or generals, but by an ordinary girl who refused to accept the world as it was. The princes in the tower, murder, mystery, and a crown at stake. Few mysteries in English history are as haunting as the tale of the princes in the tower. Two young boys, heirs to the throne of England, locked away in London's great fortress, and then, suddenly, gone. Were they murdered? If so, by whose hand? The story mixes ambition, betrayal, and blood, and it has echoed through the centuries as one of the darkest episodes of the Middle Ages. The year was 1483. King Edward IV was dead. His 12-year-old son, Edward V, was declared king. But the boy was far too young to rule, so his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped forward as protector. At first, it seemed like a natural arrangement. Richard was a seasoned warrior, respected for his loyalty. But within weeks, the situation turned sinister. Edward V and his younger brother Richard just 9 years old, were placed in the Tower of London. Officially, it was to prepare for Edward's coronation, but the coronation never came. Instead, rumours spread that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid, making his children illegitimate. With shocking speed, Parliament declared the boys unfit to rule, and who took the crown instead? Their uncle Richard, now Richard III. From that moment, the princes vanished from public view. No processions, no sightings, no word at all. The last time they were seen alive was that summer, playing in the gardens of the Tower. After that, silence. So what happened? Theories exploded almost immediately. The most common accusation was that Richard III had ordered their deaths. By removing his nephews, he erased rival claims to the throne. It was brutal, but effective at least in the short term. Chroniclers hostile to Richard painted him as a villain, describing the boys smothered in their sleep by loyal henchmen. Shakespeare later immortalized this version, turning Richard into one of history's greatest stage villains. But not everyone agrees. Some point to other suspects. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, had his own ambitions. Could he have acted without Richard's consent? Others suggest Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at Bosworth 2 years later, may have been involved, ensuring the boys would never challenge his claim. The truth is, no one can prove who gave the fatal order. Centuries later, in 1674, workers at the Tower uncovered a box containing the bones of 2 children. Were these the princes? King Charles II ordered them reburied in Westminster Abbey as royal remains. But without modern forensic tests, the mystery lingers. Were those bones truly the lost princes, or just a convenient story to close the book on a haunting past? What makes the tale so chilling is not just the crime itself, but what it represents. Medieval England was a world where crowns were won by blood and betrayal. Family ties meant nothing when power was at stake. 2 children, born as heirs to glory, became pawns in a ruthless game, and their disappearance still casts a shadow over Richard III's legacy. So were the princes murdered by their uncle? Was it Buckingham, acting on his own? Or did Henry Tudor erase them from history once he seized power? We may never know. The Tower keeps its secrets well. But one thing is certain. The fate of Edward V and his brother Richard remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of England's past. A story of innocence crushed by ambition, and of a crown bought at the highest possible cost. Richard III, Tyrant of Shakespeare, or the last good king. The image is unforgettable. A hunched figure with a crooked spine, scheming in shadows, murdering nephews, clawing for the crown. This is Richard III, as William Shakespeare painted him, the monster king, the tyrant whose evil drips from every line of the play. But history, as always, is more complicated. Was Richard truly the villain of England's nightmares? Or was he the victim of a smear campaign that blackened his name for half a millennium? To answer that, we have to peel back the layers of myth, propaganda, and power struggles that defined one of England's most controversial monarchs. Richard was born in 1452, the youngest son of the Duke of York, in an England already racked by civil war. This was the age of the Wars of the Roses, when the rival houses of Lancaster and York tore the country apart in a bloody feud for the throne. Richard grew up on battlefields, shaped by violence and loyalty to his family. By the time his brother Edward IV seized the crown for the House of York, Richard had already proven himself as a brave and capable commander. When Edward IV died in 1483, the throne should have passed peacefully to his son, the 12-year-old Edward V. But peace was the last thing England would get. Richard, as Duke of Gloucester, was named protector of the boy king. Within weeks, Edward and his younger brother were locked in the Tower of London. Then, the shocking announcement: Edward IV's marriage was declared invalid, his sons illegitimate. Richard seized the crown and was crowned king, and here lies the heart of his legend. The two princes in the tower vanished, never to be seen again. For many, the conclusion was obvious: Richard had them murdered. Shakespeare turned this suspicion into fact, making it the centerpiece of his villainous Richard. But the truth is less clear. No contemporary source provides hard evidence that Richard ordered their deaths. Some historians point to other suspects, like the Duke of Buckingham or even Henry Tudor, who would later defeat Richard. Still, the disappearance of the princes has remained a stain on Richard's name, one that history has never been able to wash away. Yet, outside of this dark mystery, Richard's reign was not the reign of a monster. In just 2 years, he introduced laws that protected ordinary people against corruption in the courts. He established the right to bail, worked to stop the abuse of wealthy lords dominating local justice, and even translated laws into English so that common people could understand them. These were not the actions of a tyrant, they were the acts of a king who believed in fairness and reform. But Richard's good governance couldn't protect him from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. His claim to the throne was always fragile, and enemies gathered quickly. Chief among them was Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian exile with a thin blood claim to the crown, but powerful allies eager to see Richard fall. The two men met on the battlefield in August 1485 at Bosworth Field. Richard, in full armour, fought with astonishing courage. Unlike many kings who stayed behind the lines, Richard led a furious cavalry charge directly at Henry himself, determined to end the fight in one blow. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer and came within a sword's length of Henry before he was surrounded. Outnumbered and betrayed by some of his own lords, Richard was killed in the melee. His last charge became legendary. Even hostile chroniclers admitted his bravery, one writing that Richard fought valiantly to the end, crying, "Treason, treason!" His crown was taken from the battlefield and placed on Henry Tudor's head, making him Henry VII and ending the Wars of the Roses. The Tudor dynasty had begun, and so had Richard's fall into infamy. Because here's the crucial detail. History is written by the victors. The Tudors had every reason to paint Richard as a monster. Henry VII's claim to the throne was weak. It rested on victory in battle, not bloodline. To justify his reign, he needed Richard to be not just defeated, but despised. Chroniclers were encouraged to describe Richard as deformed, cruel, and murderous. Shakespeare, writing more than a century later under Tudor patronage, immortalized this image in his play. The result was devastating. Richard became the ultimate villain, the hunchbacked king who murdered children and schemed his way into hell. But modern historians and even modern science have challenged this. In 2012, Richard's skeleton was discovered beneath a car park in Leicester. Far from the monstrous hunchback of Shakespeare's imagination, Richard had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. But it didn't make him a cripple. He was a battle-hardened warrior, fit enough to lead men into combat. The discovery forced the world to rethink the man behind the myth. So who was Richard III? Was he a tyrant who killed his nephews, or a reformer crushed by propaganda? The truth lies somewhere in between. He was a man of his age, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to secure power. But he was also capable, brave, and surprisingly progressive in his laws. His reputation as a monster may say more about the Tudors' need to justify their dynasty than about Richard himself. Richard's death at Bosworth ended more than a reign. It ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for 300 years. It marked the start of the Tudors, a dynasty that would bring us Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and it left us with one of the greatest historical debates of all time. Was Richard III the tyrant of Shakespeare's stage, or the last good king of a dying age? Maybe he was both, a man who lived by the sword, who grasped for power in a world where crowns were won and lost in blood, a king who reformed the law but may have murdered his nephews, a ruler remembered as a villain, but perhaps deserving of a more complicated legacy. And that, in many ways, is the perfect ending to our journey through medieval England. From the fall of Rome to the Viking storms, from Alfred's dream of unity to the 100 Years' War, from the Black Death to the mystery of the princes, this was a world shaped by ambition, faith, and survival. It was a world where kings could rise and fall in a single battle, where castles of stone held both safety and terror, and where stories have lasted longer than swords. Richard III's shadow still hangs over this story, because he embodies the question at the heart of history itself. Do we remember the truth, or do we remember the tale? And sometimes, maybe the tale is what survives. And that's where we close the book on the history of medieval England. But remember, this isn't just dusty history. These were real people, living real lives, making choices that still shape our world today. If you've enjoyed this journey through kings, castles, and conspiracies, help us keep telling these stories. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was Richard III a tyrant or a misunderstood king? And let's see if we can reach 1,000 likes to unlock our next deep dive. Because history is never really over. It waits for us in ruins, in legends, and in the stories we share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the past.